My Wherever You Are story really started. My husband and I graduated from IU. We went back to our hometowns of Cincinnati and became teachers there in the local city. And we had the summers off and a heart for missions. Every time somebody on crew was getting on an airplane, I was joining them through college. So when we graduated from college, I was looking for opportunities to do international experiences. So the high school kids in our local church, they were getting ready to go on a summer mission trip, and somebody thought we should join them. And so we did, and we went on this summer mission trip, and it was about the second to last day on that trip. And the students, we had been partnering with a local church in a town called Querétaro, Mexico, and while we were there, we were painting this wall around the outside of the church from blue to green. And the students that we had brought, about 20 of them, I looked down the row one day, and we were in the middle of this paint project, and I was realizing that they weren't feeling very captivated by what God was doing in that city. They didn't have an impression of how it was and where it was that God was moving. There was no spark, there was no energy or enthusiasm. And I looked over at my husband, I'm like, I'm pretty sure we painted this wall last year from blue to green, this year from green to blue. I know that the Lord is doing something more in this city. And he was remembering with me that when we had been in Albania, we had visited an orphanage one afternoon. And he said, do you think there are any orphans in this city? And I said, I have no idea if there's any orphans, but I am wildly tired of the paint project. Let's see what we can figure out. So we don't miss this detail. We left our students in the hands of very responsible adults, but then we jumped into a taxi cab. And I didn't speak any Spanish at the time. I'd taken French for 9 years. Like, where was Jesus in the 7th grade when I had to pick between those two languages? I don't know. And I just started to say the word orphan with the Spanish accent, like, have you ever done that before? I was like, El Orfano, El Orfanorio, El Orfanatorio, El Orfanajorio, Eventually, they figured out, the guy did, what it is we wanted, and he took us to an orphanage, and he left us there, because that's what cab drivers do. And I looked over at Todd, I'm like, honey, I don't even know the name of the street that church is on, and I don't even know if we have enough pesos to get ourselves back there whenever it's time to do that. And what in the world are we going to say to these people if they answer the door? And we should have been in this total panic, but this peace passed over us, this peace that passes understanding. And while we sat in it for about, a second, I just shoved him in front of me because he'd had a year of high school Spanish, and I pounded on the door and stepped back. And then this guy answered, and through some really creative communication, we told him we had 3 things. We had $200 US, about 20 high school students, and 1 complete day on our trip. And if he had access to any of those resources, what would he do with them? And he told us the front window had been broken and the kids hadn't had meat in over a year, and if we wanted to come back the next day and fix any of those kinds of things, we were welcome to. And I thought that sounded much better than our paint project. And I can tell you, all these years later, that's really how every day out there in the mission field begins. You just figure out what you have in your hand and who it is you want to reach out to, and then you just bridge them in the name of Jesus. And sometimes you have a car that works and a neighbor that needs a ride, and sometimes you have a couple extra dozen donuts, and you have kids that are hungry in your neighborhood. Who knows what you have, but you look at what you have and you figure out who you are reaching out to, and you just bridge them. Well, the next day we came back, and my husband went off and fixed the window with a bunch of our students, and I set up shop behind this griddle, and I've already kind of established I was wildly naive, and I didn't really know, I didn't have like a system. As the kids were coming up to the griddle to get little hamburgers that day, I didn't figure out like who had eaten, who hadn't eaten, how many had they eaten. Hadn't done any of this. I was just in my sweet spot. And they were coming up with their little cute dirty hands, and I was giving them a burger, and they were taking the burger. Anyway, Todd finishes the window, and he comes over, and he watches me for a few minutes, and he goes, do you see that little 4-year-old girl? And I told him, I can't keep my eyes off her. She's like the cutest thing I've ever seen. He's like, I'm pretty sure you took your eyes off her a few times, because that's the 5th burger she just got, and I don't really know any 4-year-olds that can eat 5 burgers. So why don't you follow her and figure out what's going on? So I grabbed her hand, and she had my hand in one and her newest burger in the other. And she began to lead me somewhere. I didn't really know where we were going, but I got to this place. I knew she was taking me somewhere. We got in the door frame of her dormitory, and there she dropped my hand, and she scampered off with her other preschool friends. And there I watched as they helped each other lift up their mattresses, because they were sticking those little burgers underneath the mattresses. And I called Todd over to that door frame, and I looked at him, and we just started talking about all the people we knew in our life that would buy hamburgers for orphans if they only knew where they were and how to get them there. And we've since called that our defining moment. We had no idea it was a defining moment. It didn't come up in neon lights, so it'd be like awesome if there was like a huge arrow that said, your whole life is about to change. I didn't have any of that action. But I can trace all the events of the last 20 years back to that door frame, when I recognized that once you know what you know, you can't ever pretend that you don't. And that we came home that next day, and everything about my life in Cincinnati looked exactly the way it had 10 days before. I went to the same grocery store, got this house, same car, same job, same everything, except something about us had shifted, and we didn't really know exactly what to do about that, but we knew we wanted to be in a posture of preparedness. So we were in this little season now, really, really small season, where we had double income, no kids. So we decided to put one of our salaries in a bank account and save it, just to be in a place where when God told us to go, we'd be ready to do it. And we just lived off the other salary. At the end of that year, we thought we were sitting on a treasure. It was 1 year of a teaching salary, so not like that big of a treasure, but it felt like a treasure. And so really, with almost no other clear understanding other than God's commission for us to go and love and serve, I actually went to the local branch bank. I said to them, I'm going to be moving to Mexico. I don't really know how long I'm going to be there. I don't really have any kind of residency or visitor status, and I don't really understand anything about international banking, and I'm not even totally sure what the currency is. But I'd like to take all of my money with me. And they said, I can't even imagine what they said afterwards, but what to me they said was, you need to just turn them all into traveler's checks. And they explained to me the process of a traveler's check, and that seemed pretty simple. So I turned our whole savings into traveler's checks, and we drove 3 days from Cincinnati, Ohio, to a city called Monterrey, Mexico, where we landed. And we had a couple hundred just cash dollars in our pocket, and then this whole savings in our traveler's checks. And after maybe a week or two, our cash had run out. We were renting this little cockroach-infested house, and it was time to go turn those things into pesos. So they told me in Cincinnati, all I had to do was go to any bank anywhere around the world, and they would return it in local currency. So I just went to this local bank right by our house, this Banorte, and there's like big, thick glass in third world countries between you and bank tellers. So I stood up in front of the glass, and I had our whole stack, and there's like a divot under the window, so it took a little while, but I shoved it all underneath the divot, and then I just smiled, because I was like, just give me all it back in pesos. We had bought a safe. That seemed like a really good idea at the time, and we were going to stick all those pesos in the safe. And the lady said to me something through that glass, like, squawk box. I didn't understand her at the time, but I now know she said, like, tienes que firmarte nombre aquí, por favor. Pon el nombre aquí en la línea, por favor. Pon el nombre en la línea. And she shoved them all back over to me. And I had really no idea what she had said. I mean, really, at that point, I knew nothing other than how to repeat our address and maybe a greeting or two. So I thought maybe she asked for my passport. So I stuck that on top of the first bill, and I shoved them all back over there to her. And she received them all, and that was absolutely not what she had asked for. And so she just did what we do when people don't understand us. She started talking to me really slow and really loud, and she said, ponte el nombre en la línea, por favor, pon el nombre en la línea, pon el nombre ahí en la línea, por favor, ponte el nombre. And she gave it all right back to me. And I was like, the people behind me were starting to laugh a little bit, and I looked over at Todd, and I'm like, hey, honey, we're not even going to be able to buy the gas to get us back to Ohio if this thing doesn't turn into pesos, so I'm just going to try again. So I stuffed them all back over to her. Anyway, she got like really mad, ponte el nombre en la línea, el nombre. And when she said that really loud, I thought, oh my gosh, I know what that word is. I've heard that word this week. So I said, give me paper and pen. So he gave me paper and pen, and I wrote really big on this paper the word nombre. And I showed it to her through the glass, and she was like, uh-huh. And so then she pointed to the line at the bottom of those checks, and I took them all back, and I wrote the word nombre, nombre, nombre at the bottom of all those checks, which clearly I should have signed my name. Anyway, one of my favorite verses is Zechariah. Yes? Okay. Zechariah chapter 4, verse 10, it says this, do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin. When you step out into God's will, it doesn't mean you have any of the answers to all the questions you had. I had so many questions that year. God did not look down at me on that day and go, dang it. Well, I mean, he probably wouldn't have said that anyway, but, golly jeepers, I sent the wrong girl. She didn't even know how to do a traveler's check. Jesus was looking down at my life that day, and he knew all of the events that had led me up into that experience and all the things that were still to come. And he knew that today, 20 years later, we'd be transferring millions of dollars in rupee and naira and pesos all the way around the world. He doesn't ask us to have it all figured out before we take that step. He just asks us to be obedient when we go where it is he tells us to go. And then all the building happens then in his hands. Our only responsibility is to become lovers and servers of one God, to have an audience of one, to ask all of our questions of him, to be obedient and take a next step. I always say reckless faith is listening to the Lord and taking just the next step. You don't have to know all the answers to all the questions that everybody's going to come bringing to you. You just listen, focus, obey, and walk, and he'll take care of all the rest of the storyline. Well, I had a chance to study a little bit in Israel recently, and I was standing on the steps of Capernaum in that town where Jesus and his disciples were in their ministry days. And it's right on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. And I don't know how many of you have had a chance to ever see the Sea of Galilee. Even in pictures, in my brain, it was going to look like an ocean, and it doesn't really look like an ocean. You can see the shoreline all the way around the Sea of Galilee, except for this one place directly across from Capernaum. There's this huge cliff, like 70, 80, 90 feet in the air, huge cliff, and it kind of dives right down into the water. And Jesus and his disciples were standing in Capernaum, and Jesus looks over the water line up into a town that was on the top of that cliff, a town in the Decapolis. And he says to his disciples in Mark chapter 4, I want to go over there to the Decapolis. Now, the disciples could have been thinking two things. The first thing they could have been thinking is, hey, we know today because of archaeologists, but they just knew because of living there that the folks over in the Decapolis, they were worshiping the gods of fertility and wine. So you can imagine what their Christmas conferences were like, right? Like maybe those people over there in the Decapolis don't want to have anything to do with us, Jesus. And then the second thing that I now know that I didn't know then, it was that Jews in the first century especially considered large bodies of water metaphorical for the abyss. That's where, right, Jonah went when he did the wrong thing and went the wrong direction. That's where the Egyptians were all swallowed up in when they chased after the Israelites. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why from their history they would believe that large bodies of water were metaphorical for the abyss. So they didn't really probably want to cross the abyss to go over there to the Decapolis. But when Jesus tells you to go somewhere, you have two choices. You either tell him yes or you tell him no. And they chose the right way. They said yes. So they get in the boat and they get halfway across on their trip over the Decapolis. And the abyss did to them exactly what the abyss does to us every time we say yes to Jesus. It kicked itself up in their face. And in their case, it came in the form of a literal storm. But I bet if we turned on the house lights and got up in a great big circle and I asked you, tell me what kind of storms you encountered on the way to saying yes to even coming to this conference. Tell me what kind of storms you've encountered as you have tried to follow the Lord faithfully on the campuses where you serve. The abyss does not like it when we say yes, and it kicked itself up in this face. And then Jesus, perfectly setting himself up for what he's about to go do in the Decapolis, he silenced that storm, that abyss, with the word out of his mouth. And he gets over there on the other side, and it says in Mark chapter 5, verse 1, that Jesus gets out of the boat. It never tells us anything about the disciples getting out of the boat. Jesus gets out of the boat, and he's immediately met by this guy whose name is Legion. And they called him Legion because he was possessed with a legion of demons. Now, this guy had been chained up in a graveyard in that town, even though he was like still alive, right? He still had like breath in his lungs and blood in his veins. The people in his community, so highly, undervalued doesn't even make sense, didn't want him, didn't see his value, didn't care about him, nothing. He had zero value. They considered him already dead. They chained him up in the graveyard. Just like, go ahead and stay there till eventually here you die. But possessed by those demons and strengthened by them, he broke out of those chains, and there he met Jesus. So Jesus takes one look at him and knows exactly what's going on. And he looks over to his left, and there on that edge of that great big cliff I saw were 2,000 pig. We now know because of archaeologists that the folks that were worshiping the gods of fertility and wine, they were sacrificing pigs on those altars. That's why they've since found thousands of pig bones on the altars of those gods. That's why they were hanging out on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. So Jesus took those demons, cast them out of those men into those pigs. Those pigs go flying off that cliff into the water. And this really has nothing to do with the story, but I do like for a second to take the mental picture of those disciples, right, who would not get out of the boat for whatever reason. They were a little worn out from their abyss crossing, so they're just like waiting for Jesus to finish whatever he's going to do there in the Decapolis. And then all of a sudden, 2,000 demon-possessed pigs come flying over their head, right? Like next time, just get out of the boat, right? That's all you have to do. Anyway, so then that man looks at Jesus just the way we would imagine. Like, I don't know who you are, but I want more of you. He looks at him and he says to Jesus, like, I want to go with you. Whoever you are, I want to go with you. Can I come with you? We really desperately want Jesus to say yes, but instead, It says, as Jesus was getting back into the boat, this is Mark 5, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. But Jesus said, no, I want you to go home to your family and tell them how much the Lord has done for you. Like, first of all, this is the family that just chained him up in the graveyard. I want you to go home to your family, tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how merciful he has been on you. So the man went off into the Decapolis, began to tell of his testimony, and all the people were amazed. Jesus gets back into that boat at that point. He goes back over that abyss, and then he goes home to Capernaum. And the first time my heart fully wrapped itself around that story, I stood over there on that shoreline and thought, you did all of that abyss crossing for one person. And it wasn't even like the mayor of Decapolis or the captain of the football team over there in the Decapolis or the man that was identified as the most strategic person to reach in order to capture Decapolis for Christ. He did all that abyss crossing for the number one most unloved, undervalued, unliked, unwanted, cast out member of that entire community. And doesn't it remind you of that story of the shepherd, right? We have a Jesus that's a shepherd, and he had 100 sheep, and one of the sheep got away. And I mean, if I was a shepherd girl, I'd be thinking 99 out of 100 sheep is really good. I mean, I have all those kids back there. If I have like most of them in the same place, I'm feeling pretty good about myself. I mean, you have one got away, like one's fine. But Jesus doesn't even want one of us to be lost, not even the guy chained up in the graveyard already left for dead. He goes after every single one. That would be enough for me. But you can learn more. I encourage you, not now, but later, to go home and Google the Decapolis. You'll see, if you click on images, these images of these two plaques that were excavated from the 1st century. They were created for two physicians, Christian physicians, it says on the plaques. They were martyred for giving their life and services to the poor. So like, just think about Jesus crossing the abyss, and the thing comes up and kicks itself in its face, and he's looking in his mind's eye for Legion and the divine appointment he's going to have with them, and just a little bit later. But I also think in his mind's eye, when he quieted that storm, he was thinking about those two physicians who would so fully capture the gospel from Legion's life that they would give their own lives for it. We read about the Decapolis one more time in Scripture. When Jesus is going to the Passover, going to Jerusalem for Passover, he crosses through the Decapolis, and it says there he's met by a crowd of believers. That's first fruit off the tree of the most least likely evangelist that I can ever think of. And if you go home and Google the Decapolis a little bit more, you'll learn in the 4th century, a man named the Bishop of Decapolis, he penned something. I bet a few of you in the room here might know by heart. It's called the Nicene Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, his only Son, our begotten Lord. That thing's going to be said on Sunday in 7 different continents. And that is all fruit hanging off the tree of a guy that nobody thought was worth going for. That's the kind of God that takes us wherever he leads. A guy who has, he's not a guy, a God who has in his mind's eye not just the storyline we're in the moment, but the storylines we're kicking off that are going to be told 100 years later when those physicians lay down their life for their king. Or 400 years later when someone is inspired to write down the details of the gospel in a way that even those who are illiterate can commit to memory and share in their regions. A story that here we are 2,000 years later talking about. That's the kind of God that we serve. And when he gets to write the storylines of our life, they get told for the rest of eternity. Well, in this particular session that we're in, we're talking a little bit about discipleship and building. And I wanted to tell you a story about 2 women who have discipled me on the mission field and the lessons that they taught me. But in order to do that, I have to tell you a little about this particular life circumstance I was in. My husband and I had been fostering a couple of girls that we had met when they were little and tried to adopt, and it didn't really end up working out for a variety of reasons, and we lost track of them for a long period of time. Then I found them a couple years later in another orphanage, and I swore I heard the Hallelujah chorus broke out when that happened, and I told the lady who was running that orphanage, like, I'm sure we're going to here to help you, but really Jesus brought me here because these little girls are supposed to be my daughters again. And it was all very, very exciting, and she'd never met me before, and she thought that was a little strange, but she began a relationship with me. Her name was Martha, and then those little girls lived in her orphanage for 7 years, and we all got to know each other pretty well. And then when those girls were 10 and 12, the 12-year-old was a wildly difficult teenager. at 12. She hadn't even really started yet. She was, she had this look on her face. I don't know if you've ever seen it on a teenage girl. She was kind of like, she was not impressed by anyone and definitely not by me any longer. And she had made a series of really bad choices that was going to get her kicked out of this orphanage. And she was going to get sent to a government orphanage. And this particular lady said to me, you know, once she goes in the government orphanage, you won't have any access to her. So why don't you come say goodbye to her in the morning? And I couldn't say goodbye to her. We'd been in her life at that point for over 10 years. So my husband and I stayed up all night long. And eventually, through our attorneys, we were able to create some kind of foster care type relationship. And we brought those little girls into our home. And she was more work than the other 9 of them combined. She was the very definition of a baby step forward and massive steps back, and became a tremendous amount of work, to the point that I often question whether I heard the call correctly to bring her into our family. It was sometimes when God asks you to do things and you get in the boat and you cross the abyss, there are days when I was like, it would actually be nicer if the weather would just clear up for a little bit, because I don't think I can get in the boat and go across the abyss one more time for her. It was literally exhausting and not fun anymore. And then when she was 15 years old, through stories that would take us pretty much the rest of the night, she finally bowed her stubborn knee before the kingdom of heaven. And I said to Todd, I am sure the rapture is going to happen any moment, because it is finished, you know. I mean, it was very exciting. Everything about her changed, including her countenance. It was beautiful. Okay. But then, thanks to the internet, some extended family members who had never had any access or any contact with them at all came into their lives and found us through Facebook and began to call my home and make threats to me, because at this point the girls were about 14 and 16, and she wanted them to come home and live with this extended aunt, this distant aunt. She wanted them to come home and work for the family business, which I won't talk about here in this Christian setting. And I knew that, although I am very for, please hear me, family reunification, in this particular case, this woman did not have these little girls' best interests in mind. And so when she called me, what I'd usually do is just hang up, right? I mean, like, that was like a really mature thing to do, but that's what I do. I just hang up. And I knew that the threats were getting excessive. They were getting stronger and stronger, and she was starting to say to me things like she was going to bring some authorities to our house, and they were going to, turn us into the police and all these things. And so finally one day she called, and I recognized the threat as having accelerated. And so I called this lady, this Martha, who had been in my life all the years those girls had been in that orphanage, and who'd become a dear mentor to me. I don't know if you know anyone like this, but she's walked with God so well and so long and so hard. I actually just like to rub up against her. It's really uncomfortable for most people around us, but I don't care. I just like to rub up against her. Like, I want some of her Jesus to come over onto me. That's what I do. And she's very used to it, and she's like almost 80 now. Or no, she is 80 now, and she's fine. She's used to it. But I just want some of that on me, So I called her and I said, Martha, they just called and they're coming. They said they're coming on Friday and they're going to bring the authorities. And I'm telling you what, those girls are not theirs. They are not theirs. You raised them the first half of their life, and I raised them the second half of their life. And if they want to hold court, I want to hold court right here in my house. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to bring every piece of paper you have on them, every dental record, every school record, every visitor log nobody ever signed. I want you to bring every picture you put on your refrigerator. You bring everything from your part. I'll get everything ready from my part. If some authority wants to set foot in my house, we'll tell them exactly where he can go. And, we were on the telephone, so she probably would have rubbed something up against me, I'm sure, at that point with that attitude. But she just said very calmly, I'll be there on Friday, and I'll bring what I need to. And I said, okay, I'm so glad. So I spent, like 20 hours that week kind of putting some stuff together. She shows up on Friday, pulls into the front yard with this little minivan, and I help her get out of the car. And she had a really big bag I got out of the back seat. And I was thinking, this is a great sign, because I also had a really big bag. And I'm thinking, your big bag and my big bag, nobody's going to have anything to do with this. These people came into our ministry campus about a half an hour after that, and the best way I can describe it to you is they sounded like an angry mob of bees. As soon as I got out of the car, they started to swear and yell, and it was really chaotic, and they were just like they were just, they were just screaming and swearing and yelling. And I had come out of the house when I saw them come onto campus, and I walked out, and I'm used to being able to talk to people with my mouth, right? So I'm all like, would anybody like some iced tea? We have some lemonade in the house. Welcome, bienvenidos aquí. Like I was like trying to be hospitable and invite them into my home and let's have a conversation. But they were not stopping their noise in order to listen to what I have to say. So I just started to walk towards the house, and they followed me. And our houses are made of cement, right, of concrete. So when you get inside of them, the acoustics are really loud. And so their swearing and yelling it was deafening. And these little girls of ours were sitting at the dining room table, and next to them was my friend Martha. And they were, it was quite a scene, okay? And nobody was stopping talking. So I stood on my dining room chair, and I just yelled at the top of my lungs, I think Martha has something she'd like to say. And everybody just stops and looks at her. And she smiles at me, and she reaches down for her bag. And I knew, and she knew, that the smoking gun that we had was a visitor log that nobody had ever signed in all the years of their life. And so I was thinking, let's not waste any time. Get out the smoking gun. So she reaches into her bag, and I'm kind of smiling. And she pulls out a Bible, which, these people do not necessarily share our faith. I wasn't really sure where we were going with this. And so she opens up to Psalm chapter 1 and begins to read about a tree planted by stream of water, and in season it's going to bear fruit. It was a beautiful psalm. But, I don't really care what your faith is. Some beautiful 80-year-old lady starts to read from the Holy Scriptures. You're afraid of like a lightning bolt, right? So they just got really quiet. They just stayed quiet while she was reading. And she finished Psalm 1. I remember thinking, you've done, like our heartbeats are slowed. You have command of the room. The visitor log. She doesn't even take a breath. She goes right into Psalm 2. I'm like, why do the nations plot in vain? And it's not nearly as quotable as Psalm 1. I wasn't really sure what we were doing. She finishes Psalm 2, right into Psalm 3. She goes into Psalm 4, Psalm 5, Psalm 6, Psalm 7, Psalm 8. At this point, I kind of like political things. I'm like, we're in a spiritual filibuster, right? Because there are a lot of Psalms in this book. Eventually, they're going to have to go to the bathroom. They're going to get hungry. She's in Psalm 9. We get into Psalm 10, and I could hear something about her voice had changed a little bit. And she was landing somewhere. We got on the end of Psalm 10, and she said this. Oops, I just lost it. We were in the end of Psalm 10, and she said this. You hear, O Lord, the desire of the afflicted. You hear them, and they cry. You will bring justice to the orphan and the oppressed, in order that man who is of this earth may terrify them no more. Then she closed her Bible and she said, these little girls are daughters of the King Most High. They don't belong to us any more than they belong to you. You ask them where their king has told them to be. And the big one, even in Christ, is a little feisty, right? So she's like, aquí, which means here in Spanish, right? And the little one, she's like, aquí. And I would be lying to you if I told you that at that point they stood up and shook my hand and thanked me for years of service in their family and then walked out my door. That's not what happened. But they did push themselves away from the table, and all of a sudden the sound returned, like the screaming, the shouting, and the swearing. But they were making their way towards my front door. So, I didn't know how to stop them. I already established that. So I just went behind them, and I opened up our front door. And they were saying such terrible things I never wanted those little girls to hear. But they were saying them as they were walking out, and they were like saying all these terrible things. And they go over here, and they get to their car, and I see that their cars. I'm like, I'm opening up our campus gate. And they get in their car, and they were saying these terrible things, and they go flying out the gate. And I shut that gate, and I just sat there and thought, I worked easy 25 hours this week putting together some files. The lady read 10 Psalms and they're gone. Are you kidding me? So I go running back in the house, I'm like elated really actually, and I'm like all ready to do the rub up against her thing. I'm like, you did it. I cannot believe you did it. When did you decide you were going to do that? You did it. Did God tell you to do that? What? 10 Psalms. What were you going to do? How many more are you going to do? I had all these questions for her, but she was not done yet. She got her Bible, which is a whole lot bigger than this one, and she stuck that thing right in my face, and she said, I want you to hear me, daughter. Don't you ever forget, this is the only sword you ever take into your battles. I was like, yes. And that particular lesson built itself into my life like almost none other has. It is the wielding of this sword the consumption of this word. Joshua 1:8 says, do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth, but consume it like a lion would its prey. It actually says, do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth, but meditate on it day and night. And then you can be careful to do everything that's written in it so that you'll be prosperous and successful. Meditate in the Hebrew language is this word, this onomatopoeia. Remember onomatopoeias back from like high school English class? They're words that sound like what they really are. So the word in Hebrew that we translate as meditate is really this Hebrew word called Hagah, H-A-G-A-H, Hagah. So I want you to say, when I count to 3, the word Hagah, but I want you to say it in a way that would sound like a lion was consuming its prey, because that's what Hagah literally means. Just like in English we have onomatopoeias like pop and boom and hiss. Those words sound like what they mean. Hagah literally means the sound a lion makes when he consumes his prey. So say it for me. Ready? 1, 2, 3. So that verse really says, do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth, but consume it like a lion would its prey. Then you can be careful to do everything that's written in it. That's really what happened when Jesus got halfway across the abyss. He used the word out of his mouth in order to calm the storm. Today we have the words out of his mouth that we can consume and use when those storms come at us. And my temptation was to use my own flesh, my own experiences, my own capabilities, my own giftings, my own talent in order to make that storm go away in my life. But she taught me, that sweet Martha Rojas, what it means in order to stand up against the abyss and to fight the battle so that we can wake up the next day and do it all over again. Then another woman that taught me this story is, came to visit us, okay? So he's from our hometown, and he met me up at church once. We lived in Mexico. Did I already say that? We lived in Mexico all these years. So, a little detail. So he came and saw me after church, and he's like, Beth, do you have time for a quick story? And I was like, sure. And he said, have you ever heard of my mother? Her name was Barbara Shaw. And I was like, I actually just met you. So no, I definitely have not met your mother, And then his next sentence was, well, she died this spring. And so I just was like, I'm sorry for your loss. I don't know her. He's like, oh, I thought maybe you heard of her. She's kind of known as an intercessory prayer warrior, and I know she'd prayed for your ministry some. And when he said that, I said, you know what, I have not ever met her, but I think I do remember people telling me that they'd passed on a request to Barbara Shaw, and Barbara Shaw was praying for us. And he said, well, here's what happened. A couple of years ago, you had a fundraiser. Do you remember when you had a fundraiser and you auctioned off some paintings? And I was like, oh, yeah, I remember that. Some high school girl was like really gifted in art, and she asked me for a stack of photographs that she translated onto oil canvases, and we auctioned them off to raise some money. He said, my mom had been praying for some family's child who'd been in the hospital, and as a thank you, they bought one of those paintings and they gave them to my mother. And that painting, representing some children from your ministry, has been hanging in our house for the last 4 years. He said, here's the deal. The last couple years when she was bedridden with her cancer, she would just lay on the couch in the living room and work all day long in her prayers. And people would say, are you ready to go home and meet your Savior? And she'd say, no, I'm working so hard today. I'm praying for my children and my grandchildren, my pastor, and missionaries around the world. And she'd list all the people she was praying for, including the children that were represented on the painting that had been hanging over her couch where she was resting. And he said, when she was getting ready to die, she said to me, Mark, I don't really care where all the rest of the stuff in this house goes, but this painting, in my spirit, I know I'm not done yet. And I don't know what it looks like to intercede on the other side of eternity. So you take this painting home with you, and you pray for these children in this painting. And he's like, what do you tell your dying mother, right? You just go, okay, Mom, I'll take the painting, and I'll pray for the kids, He said, she just died a few months ago, and this painting has now been in my home, and I've been praying for it, but I don't really have her gifts, and I pretty much just say the same thing every day, and I don't really feel like I'm doing anything. So here's what I did. I took a picture of the painting, and I want to show it to you so you can tell me the specific stories of those children so I can pray more specifically. How do you feel about that? And at this point, he's crying. So Jesus and I begin to have a little internal conversation where I tell him, the girl was a good painter, but what if I don't recognize the children? And, orphan ministry can be kind of transient, and this was several years ago. So I tell Jesus, how about I just tell him like a representative story? And somehow between his prayer life and your heavens, you just fix it and apply it to exactly the right people. Like, I don't really care how you do it, but I'll just tell him a story, and you just fix it. Because he's crying, and I can't tell him I don't know what he's talking about. But Jesus, just put this in your hat, never gives you a green light ever for deception. So, he says no to me in my spirit, and I think, okay, here it comes, the picture. So he pulls it out of his Bible, and as he pulls it out of his Bible, I call all my kids near me because they know all the kids at all the orphanages, and I thought they would recognize maybe something. I thought they also had probably a larger gray stick, so if they said something, I would just go with it and run. And so he pulls this picture out, and as soon as I look at it, I just start like this. I just fell like this. And so did my foster daughters, my 14 and 16-year-old foster daughters, because we recognized it as a picture of them. It was a picture from one of our Christmases. It had somehow gotten stuck inside of that other stack of photographs, got sent to some girl in Des Moines, Iowa, who painted it on an oil canvas, who shipped it to Ohio, where it got auctioned off by some people who gave it to Barbara Shaw, who had hung over her couch, so that this lady would intercede for 4 years for the life of these 2 children in her painting. So on all the days when I couldn't get across the abyss, and all the days I didn't want to do it even one more day, and all the days when I said, I'm done, it's hard, I'm over, this is no fun, I can't. He used the prayers of this Barbara Shaw to lift me up and carry me across there one more day so I could say yes again to what he asked me to do. The first thing I said to Mark Shaw was, well, if you're looking for a list of specific prayer requests, get your pen and paper out right now, because I got all kinds of them for you. And then I said, do you understand your mama co-labored with me in the salvation of these little girls? Yes, I can't wait to meet Barbara Shaw one day, who is in heaven. But yes. But she built into my life a story that has revolutionized the way I do ministry. I used to be a girl who did 90% of the work and 10% of my prayers. And my prayers would just be like, oh, Jesus, please bless this thing that we're doing today. And I've been trying to invert that and do 90% of the work on my knees, and 10% I go out covered by the host of angels who have listened as we have stormed the heavens on behalf of the people that we are heartbroken don't know him yet. And that's a whole different kind of ministry when we live that way. Okay, last story. I already clearly established the fact that I like to do things on my own flesh and my own strength, and I struggled deeply. And God decided to teach me this beautiful lesson through a 4-year-old boy. I was speaking at a church here in the United States when I was home one time raising support, and this guy afterwards came up to me. He's like, hey, are you talking about Monterrey, Mexico? I go there on business. Why don't we exchange business cards? And the next time I'm there, I'll take you and your family out to dinner. You can show me around to your children's homes. And clearly he missed my bio of all the kids we had, but I said, that's a great idea. So we switched business cards. But I had a skirt with no pockets, and I instantly lost his business card, and he didn't lose mine. And 4 months later, when he was in the city, he called me, and I recognized his voice, and his name was Carlos. And he said, hey, I'm downtown. It was a Saturday. I'm downtown. I'll be done around 6. Would you come down and pick us up? And I think that'd be great if we could have some dinner, and you could give us a tour of what's going on. And I said, that's a great idea, Carlos. And I didn't know his last name, didn't know who he worked. I didn't know any of those things, but I thought he seemed like a really nice person, so sure. Meanwhile, that exact same day, one of the children's homes that we serve, a children's home called Manantial de Amor, it was run by a man named Edgar. And Edgar had been getting a little bit concerned that the kids in his children's home were placing us in a place that only Jesus should be, that instead of every good and perfect gift coming from God, it was kind of like every good and perfect gift was coming from us. And he was worried that the kids were getting the wrong idea. And so he woke up that morning and he recognized that he only had enough money in his cash box to buy what we call in Spanish an almuerzo, or a brunch, for the 50 kids that Saturday morning that he was taking care of. He didn't have any more money or any more food for any more meals that day. So after he served them brunch, they waited about 6 more hours, and then he called those same kids around a table, and they all thought they were coming for supper. And he said to them in a circle, hey, you know what, you all, I don't have any idea what we're going to eat tonight. But I know a few things for sure, and one of them is you are the most beloved, precious treasure of the King Most High. So let's ask him to bring us some dinner tonight. The kids thought that was kind of weird, but whatever, they did it. So they all bowed their heads because they were hungry, and they began to pray. But one of the boys at the table, this 4-year-old boy, his name is Joel. And I don't know if you've ever been in a prayer time with a 4-year-old, but they don't really sit still very well. So he was in the prayer maybe 30 seconds, and he raised his hand. He's like, Tio, 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 which means uncle in Spanish. Tio, Tio. Are we praying that God brings us dinner? And Edgar stopped the prayer. He was actually looking for the teachable moment, so it was perfect. So he stopped the prayer, and he's like, yes, I am. We're praying that God brings us dinner. And he's like, well, what kind of dinner does God bring you? And he's like, I don't really know what kind of dinner God's going to bring us. Let's pray and just see. And so they began to, bow their heads and pray again. But his little mind was just thinking. He goes, deal. And he interrupted them again. He's like, do you think if it's God, do you think he's going to bring us meat? And Edgar stopped the prayer again, kind of no choice. And he looks at Joel and he's like, I don't really have any idea what he's going to bring us. But yeah, we can pray for some meat. So they bow their heads and they're praying some more. Well, it's just like thinking. And he's like, do you think if it's meat, well, what kind of meat do you think it'll be exactly? Because, this boy had his share of salchichas, of hot dogs in life. So he was like, what kind of meat is God going to bring you? And Edgar said, honestly, I have no idea what kind of meat God's going to bring you. He said, I do, I know. I bet if it's God, I bet he brings us steak. So they just keep praying, who knows how many more times that went on. Meanwhile, my friend Carlos calls me back, and he's like, do you guys have a pickup truck? And I said, yeah, we have a pickup truck. He's like, when you come down, will you be willing to bring your pickup truck? I've got tons of leftover product, and I can't take it back across the border, and it's just sitting out all day, and people are actually already starting to throw stuff away in the dumpsters. I keep thinking about you all and that you might be able to use it. Do you want any of it? And I said, sure, we'd like some of it. Not even, I lost his business card. I wasn't even sure what kind of product we were talking about, And so I said, yeah, definitely. And so I hang up, and Todd was like, that's not acceptable. I cannot not know what it is that we are not going to get from a person whose name we don't even know at a place we're not even sure where it is. Like, you need a little more detail. So I called Carlos back. I'm like, hey, what kind of product are we talking about? And he said, oh, I work for the John Morrell Meat Company. I'm here at a meat convention. I just keep thinking you guys could use it. And I was like, oh, definitely. If it goes in the mouth, we could definitely use it. So Todd said he was going to go on down early before me and just check it all out. So he calls me from the meat convention, and after having met Carlos, and he said, hey, you know what, Beth, we just have like a little deep freezer at home. He's like, there's so much meat I've already put in the back of the pickup truck. I got these big tie-down straps holding the boxes in. This is way more than fits in our deep freezer. So forget dinner and the kids. I'm just going to start driving to the children's homes right now with him, and we're going to just deliver all this tonight as we go around. So would you be willing to call ahead and ask everybody if they're home and if they're okay and if they have room in their freezer and if I can drop off some stuff? And I said, sure, I'll make those calls. There'd be about, 9 or 10 of those calls to make. The first call on that list would be Edgar. He was 8 blocks from the convention center. So I call Edgar up. I'm like, hey, it's Beth. I was just calling to see if you're around tonight. And he's like, yeah, we're here tonight. I'm like, oh, great. Todd's on his way over right now with somebody in a donation. I just wanted to make sure you guys were there. Okay, talk to you later. And he's like, no, wait, what's he bringing? And I said, you know what, I'm not with him. I don't really know, but he wanted me to make sure you had some room in your freezer. And he goes, I got some room in my freezer. And I said, oh, okay, well, good. Well, he's on his way over, And I'm getting ready to hang up because I'm thinking to myself, I've got 9 more calls to make. And he goes, no, wait. You don't have any idea what he's bringing over in the freezer? And I said, you know what, I'm not with him. I do know that he's downtown at that meat convention, though, so it's probably some kind of meat. And he just gets quiet. He's such a good friend, and he's like, do you know what kind of meat? And I said, I don't have any idea what kind of meat, but, like, when did we get so picky in the orphan business? Really, I was thinking. And so I said, he said, would you mind terribly finding out before he comes over what exactly he's bringing? And so I put on my best missionary voice and said, no, that would be my pleasure. Hold on, I'll be right with you. So I hang up with him, and I call Todd. I'm like, I don't know what is going on with Edgar, but he'd like to know exactly what is coming over in the boxes you're bringing. And he's like, oh, Beth, you cannot imagine. They're trying to attract some new restaurant business. Monterey, the city we lived in, 6 million people. He's like, he had the most incredible cuts of steak, filet mignon, and New York strip, and T-bone, and sirloin, and their USDA and Choice A. He's like, I don't even know if they know how to fix it, but we're on our way over with it, And I said, okay, well, I'll let him know. So I hang up. I'm like, Edgar, guess what? Filet mignon, New York strip, T-bone, sirloin, USDA, Choice A. That got room in your freezer for anything like that? And at that point, he tells me what had been going on in his home for almost the last hour. Then he holds the phone away from his mouth and he yells out to the kids, hey, kids, God's on his way over with your steak. And yes, I love that story for 2 reasons. The first reason I love it, because I think God has big plans in store for that little boy that he taught him at age 4. It takes faith the size of a mustard seed to move a mountain. You don't get faith any smaller than a 4-year-old orphan. Literally, you do not get faith smaller than a 4-year-old orphan. And he taught him and all the rest of us that hear his story that you look at the audience of one, you put your eyeballs on the one that sees you as his most treasured possession, and you watch him do more than just show up. He comes and he loves to show off. And I think God has a big story in part for Joel. I can't wait to watch him as he grows. The second reason that I like to tell that story is because here's what happens to me. I don't like to get my back against the wall. And when I get my back up against the wall the way Edgar purposely put himself, my first inclination is to cry out to man. You know what would have happened if he would have called me that morning and said I didn't have enough money and I don't have anything for dinner? I would have taken him over an emergency kit of things like beans and rice and eggs and oil and tortilla. That feels like it fills you up, but the truth is it's pretty cheap. When he got himself with his back against the wall, he didn't call out to man, he called out to God. And when you call out to God, you get more than beans and rice and eggs and oil and tortilla. You get steak. And we have a God that wherever you are, wherever you go, longs to train you up, to teach you how and where and when to step, how to go. It says in Isaiah, before you take a step to the left or the right, you ask him in which way you are to go. He has enormous storylines for you. Do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to watch the stories begin. He rejoices to watch the work begin in you. Lean in, choose yes, raise your hand, step forward, go, watch him, pray, learn all the lessons for yourself, watch him build into your storyline, spend more time on your knees than you do on your feet. Go and watch him do incredible things as you share the gospel all around the world. Thank you. Thanks.